June 5, 1944, London, underground war room under Parliament. The lamplight was low and yellow. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and damp wood, and rain tapped like a soft metronome on the windows above. The table ran long, maps spread like pale islands, and Winston Churchill sat with his hands folded, eyes on the papers, but ears open. For hours men had argued about tides and gliders and supply windows. Tonight, three voices would split the room into forecast, fear, and faith. One predicted ruin in hours, another promised victory at a price, and a third kept silent until a small scrap of evidence would force everyone to reinterpret the whole plan. What did they truly think would happen at dawn over Normandy? This was not a debate about ships and guns alone. It was a test of psychology, of deception, of whether the mind of an adversary could be used as surely as its guns. If they were right, the cost of blood would be measured differently. If they were wrong, the maps on the walls would be canvases of bodies. The question that followed the cigarette smoke hung in the air like a challenge to fate. Could perception be weaponized more effectively than artillery and armor? The answer would decide more than a beachhead. In the next hour, the room would trade arithmetic for strategy, and one quiet file would change everything they thought they knew about the invasion. In the room were Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Admiral Andrew Cunningham, General Bernard Montgomery, Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, Captain James Harrow of Naval Planning, Evelyn Carter from Naval Intelligence, codebreaker Tom Bennett from Bletchley Park, courier Samuel Price, translator Marie Dupont, and journalist Arthur Hughes observing at Churchill's invitation. The light made their faces hard. Brooke tapped his finger on the wood. Cunningham smelled faintly of sea spray. Montgomery adjusted his cuff and stared at a patch on the map that read Normandy. Harrow unfolded a chart. Carter placed a yellowed envelope on the table. The first exchange began with Brooke. Brooke said quietly, "Why are we certain the coast is the right coast to hit?" Cunningham answered, "We control the fleet, but not the skies yet." Montgomery replied, "We strike where we can gain lodgment and press forward." Carter interrupted with a note of ice. "We have intercepted signals that suggest landings elsewhere." Harrow leaned in. "Where was that expected landing?" Carter said, "Pas de Calais." Bennett added, "We have decrypted traffic pointing to preparations there." Montgomery frowned. "Does that mean we are walking into a trap?" Brooke said, "If they have concentrated there, our assault could be encircled." Cunningham said, "Or they will thin forces and our assault can succeed." Harrow asked, "Which is it then?" Carter paused, then said, "There is one more variable, the German belief in our intention, which they have been fed by their own intelligence and by staged evidence." Montgomery snapped, "That sounds like hope."
Bennett pushed back. "Hope can be engineered if the facts you feed are convincing." Churchill, who had been listening, tapped the table once and asked, "What makes you confident this is more than luck?" Carter met his gaze and said, "We will show the room why perception trumps force if you allow us to finish." The exchanges were 6, then 8 in quick turns, each breath heavy with tobacco and rain, hands rubbing stubbled faces, maps creased under the spreading light, the tick of a clock counting decisions. The smell of wet wool and ink and coffee threaded the talk, and every voice carried weight because each had played a part in the months of planning. The room contained 3 distinct forecasts. The first was bleak and precise. In that account, Admiral Cunningham, now speaking with grim arithmetic, painted bodies and broken craft. He explained in measured numbers how a strong defended coastline could lead to catastrophic losses within hours. He described enemy batteries with ranges overlapping the sand, barbed stretches that would funnel men into kill zones, and reserves within striking distance. He quoted reports intercepted by German radio of recently repaired coastal batteries and cited reconnaissance photographs of emplaced guns. He said, "If their artillery is zeroed and their panzer divisions are nearby, we will bleed to death before we reach a foothold." The words fell like cold rain. Faces went pale. Samuel Price shifted his weight, and Marie Dupont covered her mouth. Arthur Hughes wrote in shorthand as if to preserve the horror. The second forecast came from General Montgomery and Harrow together. Their voice was stern and confident and costly. Montgomery admitted the attack could be won, but only by committing overwhelming numbers and accepting staggering casualties. He ran calculations of troop-to-defender ratios, numbers of landing craft available, and the time it would take to build up sufficient armor ashore. Harrow outlined the logistical nightmare of supply in the first 7 days and the likelihood of losing most first-wave craft. Montgomery said, "Victory is achievable, but it will be purchased with blood, the kind that leaves no one unchanged." Cunningham countered, "That is bravery in the face of madness if the enemy has reserves nearby." The room split between the arithmetic of doom and the arithmetic of sacrifice. Before the silence, before anyone spoke again, viewers would be invited to decide. If you are sitting there wondering which prediction you would have believed, write in the comments which voice felt most plausible. Diz closed the first, Diz closed the second, or Diz closed the third. Tell us succinctly, starting with said the first, said the second, or said the third, and explain in one sentence why. Your answer helps us understand how people weigh risk and how history looks different through today's lens. Now back to the table. After the bleak and the costly came the quiet revelation. Evelyn Carter, who had been mostly in the background and who had
The look of someone worn by night sorting cables, slid the yellowed envelope forward. She said, "This is a double forgeries file compiled by our deception unit." Bennett added, "The enemy is not only listening, they are seeing what we let them see." Carter opened the envelope and produced a photocopy of a letter, a set of dummy uniforms painted with unit markings, and a forged cable that had been fed through fake channels. She narrated step by step how Operation Fortitude and a web of false radio traffic had created an image of an invasion force poised at Pas-de-Calais. She described agents like Marie Dupont, who had been seen in certain towns, and a courier such as Samuel Price, who had delivered planted documents to a double agent. She named double agent Garbo, who transmitted a narrative that the Germans preferred. She produced a report from French farmer Louis Mercier and testimony from translator Paul Moreau, who had overheard German units discuss expected landings. The room hushed as she traced the plan of manufactured evidence from bogus wireless nets to inflated troop lists to phony radio chatter that Bletchley Park had allowed to be intercepted. Bennett read an intercept where a German staff officer told a superior that the Allied main effort would be at Calais because everything they saw suggested so. Churchill leaned forward and said, "If they believe it will be there, they will hold their strength there and leave weakness where we land." Brooke said, "So we are not merely attacking a beach, we are attacking an idea." Montgomery said, "Then this is not trickery, this is tactical psychology." Carter added, "Exactly, it is engineered misperception." The exchanges in this scene numbered 7, with breaths held between each line, cups clinking, the rustle of paper punctuating the logic. Sensory details peppered the reveal. The scratch of Bennett's pen as he underlined a decrypted line, the metallic tang of wet brass from the lamp,
the distant rumble of a train above that sounded like an approaching storm. Evidence was laid out, a cable stamped with dates, a photograph of dummy tanks made of plywood, a report annotated by double-agent contacts, a signed log by courier Samuel Price, and a note from Captain James Harrow confirming the naval feints that would support the illusion. That was the key hidden in plain sight. The Alliance had not simply planned a physical assault. They had orchestrated an extensive deception to bend the enemy's expectations. The explanation was tactical psychological warfare, armed with forgeries and staged movements designed to make the Germans commit reserves where there was nothing to fight. The next morning, the invasion unfolded with both brutal clarity and terrible cost. At dawn, the sea was cold and gray, and the sound of engines was a harsh thrum under the turning sky. Landing craft rose and fell, salt burning the lips, steel groaning, men shouting orders over the wind. Paratroopers tumbled into orchards where hedgerows smelled of damp earth and gunpowder. On the beaches, the assault hit intense resistance, and yet elsewhere German commanders paused. Their headquarters received continued traffic pointing to Calais, and Rommel remained in Germany for a birthday. German panzer divisions were delayed or sent the wrong way. In the first hours, casualties were high, but the lack of rapid coordinated counterattack proved decisive. A platoon under Lieutenant Edward Riley held a hedgerow with bayonets, and a stretcher-bearer named Samuel Price unrolled a map and passed it back as shells thudded. A nurse named Margaret Ellis bandaged wounds with trembling hands, and the journalist Arthur Hughes recorded the noise with a steadier hand than his own heart. The deception worked not by preventing loss, but by shifting the balance of reserves the enemy could not mobilize in time. Small acts of courage at the edge of Normandy combined with a misled enemy posture to create a fragile foothold. The result was not a tidy victory, but a hard-earned beachhead that allowed the buildup needed to push inland. The human cost was undeniable, and numbers were measured in bereaved letters back home and hollow spaces at tables. Strategy had won a tactical advantage, but paid in flesh. In the months after the invasion, the consequences rippled in ways both immediate and bureaucratic. 1 month later, many of the officers in that room were dealing with the immediate human and political fallout. Alan Brooke wrote a concise operational review that acknowledged the role of deception in the invasion and cataloged losses while requesting reinforcements. Winston Churchill received a constant stream of dispatches and condolence letters while preparing speeches to steady the public. Evelyn Carter's file was circulated to key commands and to Allied intelligence stations in Algiers and Cairo. Tom Bennett was summoned to other boards to explain intercept methodologies and the limits of signals intelligence. Samuel Price returned to civilian life briefly, but was later asked to testify in committees about the role of couriers in feeding false narratives. Families of the fallen, such as the parents of Lieutenant Edward Riley, were given preliminary accounts and faced the earliest stages of public grief. The official narrative in newspapers emphasized heroism and tactical necessity, and newspapers like The Times printed diagrams and quotes from Churchill to frame the story for a nation exhausted by war. 3 months later, the picture had begun to change in strategic assessments. Allied planning staffs had used lessons from deception to refine future operations and to formalize the use of double agents and staged hardware. Intelligence units like Carter's received increased funding, and teams of specialists expanded efforts to coordinate visual and signals deception. Investigations into logistics showed where shortages had nearly derailed plans and led to accelerated production of landing craft. Families that had been in limbo received more detailed casualty reports, and some communities held memorials that blurred public mourning with stiff patriotic resolve. Internationally, the success of the operation forced Germany to redistribute its forces, naturalizing the perception that the tide had turned and affecting diplomatic calculations in Spain and Turkey. Codes that Bennett had shown to be effective were adapted for other theaters, and Bletchley Park's reputation grew into institutional authority.
6 months later, the strategic landscape had shifted markedly. The beachhead had become a series of linked fronts, and the war in Western Europe had new momentum. Operational doctrines now incorporated deception as a standard tool, and courses on strategic misdirection were taught in staff colleges. Evelyn Carter's file became a case study in military history, and her methods were cited by historians as a turning point in modern warfare. Memorials for the dead had been dedicated in towns from Portsmouth to Bayeux, and families continued to rebuild lives, while letters from commanders thanked units for sacrifice and highlighted the moral complexity of decisions made under fire. Politically, Churchill's standing in some circles rose because the narrative of a clever and necessary stratagem fit national needs, while critics argued that deception had obscured the true cost paid by frontline units. The implications lasted beyond battlefields. Military doctrine evolved to treat perception as terrain to be contested, and the moral questions about engineered beliefs entered public debate. The final lesson lingered in the quiet corners of staff rooms and family kitchens alike. Strategy had been decisive because it reached into minds, not just into trenches. Victory required not only force, but the audacity to shape what the enemy expected. In the end, the maps were redrawn not solely by tanks, but by carefully constructed illusions and by the courage of men and women who executed both the feints and the frontal assaults. If there is one memory from that night under the lamp, it is this: a small envelope and a soft-spoken intelligence officer altered the course of a campaign and reminded us that wars are won as much by ideas as by bullets. If you want more stories that peel back the planning, the mistakes, and the human cost behind historic operations, subscribe and join the conversation.